10 years ago, I had this list in my head. I never dreamt that I'd get to the end of that list. So I've decided to end my River Monsters journey.
Fans were stunned when River Monsters disappeared from television, and no one got a clear answer. The show was a global phenomenon, drawing millions into murky waters, mysterious creatures, and high-stakes encounters. But after 9 intense seasons, it simply ended. What happened behind the scenes? Why would a top-rated series, hosted by one of the most respected figures in wildlife television, suddenly vanish? Today, we're diving into the untold story behind River Monsters, one that's been quietly overlooked for years and might just change the way you remember the show forever. He caught every monster. River Monsters didn't end because it was losing steam. It didn't fade out because of drama or network politics. No, the reason was far more rare and strangely satisfying. Jeremy Wade, the man who made monster hunting a global obsession, simply caught everything there was to catch. In a world where most shows stretch themselves thin to stay alive, River Monsters did something few ever do. It ended at the top, not because it had to, but because it had completed its mission. And the man behind it all didn't just host a show. He conquered a lifelong challenge that would have crushed most people before the first season ever aired. From the very beginning, River Monsters was different. This wasn't just a show about fishing. It was an expedition series, a detective story, and a wildlife thriller rolled into one. But behind every dramatic pull of the fishing line, there was a bigger goal. Jeremy Wade had built a mental list of legendary, often mythical, freshwater creatures that had haunted local folklore, terrified river communities, and intrigued scientists for decades. These were creatures that lived in the shadows: giant catfish accused of drowning villagers, predatory arapaimas the size of small cars, and the infamous Goliath tigerfish with its rows of dagger-like teeth. What started as a hopeful concept, tracking these creatures one by one, quickly evolved into something much more intense. With each season, Wade crossed another name off his list. Some took months, others took decades. The Goliath tigerfish, for example, was his white whale. He spent more than 20 years trying to find it, and when he finally did, during Season 2, it was more than just a catch. It was a moment that defined him. As the seasons rolled on, viewers followed Wade across continents, through the Congo, the Amazon, the Himalayan foothills, and the swamps of Southeast Asia. And as the show grew in popularity, so did Wade's ambition. He wasn't content with easy catches or second-hand stories. Every fish had to be rooted in mystery, fear, and deep ecological significance. The stakes were high, and the storytelling was real. But beneath all the on-screen excitement was a quiet reality. The list was getting shorter. Each new season brought fewer remaining monsters that fit the original premise of the show. And when the final season aired in 2017, the truth became clear, not just to Wade, but to the network too. Animal Planet didn't cancel River Monsters in the traditional sense. In fact, they celebrated it. Executives praised Jeremy Wade's unmatched ability to hold an audience, to turn scientific curiosity into edge-of-your-seat storytelling. But they also acknowledged the simple fact: River Monsters was built around finding legends, and the legends were gone. Wade himself put it plainly in a press release. 10 years ago, I had a list in my head which seemed impossibly ambitious at the time, but everything has now been ticked off, and then some. It was one of the most unusual reasons a show had ever ended. Most hosts begged networks for one more season. Wade ended his run because he had nothing left to prove. He had stared down the most feared predators in freshwater history, pulled them into the light, and told their stories with honesty and awe. For fans, it was bittersweet. They wanted more, but they also understood. Wade had done something truly rare. He didn't get canceled. He won. And just when fans thought that was Wade's final cast, they learned about what he endured behind the scenes. The brutal reality behind the scenes. What River Monsters didn't always show was just how much Jeremy Wade sacrificed to bring each episode to life. Viewers saw the final product: clean shots of murky rivers, the moment of the catch, the narration layered with folklore and scientific insight. But that polished version often concealed a relentless, dangerous, and exhausting process. The truth is, Wade wasn't just battling elusive fish. He was battling some of the harshest conditions on the planet, and the scars he collected along the way weren't always physical. Jeremy Wade filmed in places few people dared to visit. These weren't tourist destinations or typical wildlife hotspots. They were remote jungles, unmarked riverbanks, and politically unstable regions where outsiders were rare and conditions were unforgiving. To reach these places, Wade often traveled for days, sometimes on foot, other times in flimsy dugout canoes, hauling camera gear, fishing equipment, and survival supplies through dense vegetation and suffocating humidity. There were no trailers, no comforts, no shortcuts, and while the show captured suspense, it didn't always reveal the real risk involved. Wade contracted malaria more than once during filming. In one interview, he admitted to collapsing from exhaustion after hours under the scorching sun. There were insect bites that swelled to the size of tennis balls, tropical infections that could have turned deadly, and nights spent sleeping in mosquito net tents under skies alive with howling animals and stifling heat. The environments were beautiful, but brutal. Perhaps most terrifying were the places where there was no backup. In many cases, Wade and his team operated without immediate medical help. One wrong move, a slip on wet rocks, a bite from the wrong insect, or a run-in with a territorial crocodile could have turned deadly. There were moments, Wade later admitted, when he seriously questioned whether the show was worth it. But each time, he pushed forward, driven by his obsession to document species the world had either misunderstood, ignored, or completely forgotten. And it wasn't just the physical toll. The psychological burden built up over time, spending weeks in isolation, constantly adjusting to different cultures, languages, dangers, and expectations, wore on Wade more than he let on during the show's run. He had to balance being a host, biologist, explorer, and leader for a small crew, all while making sure the final footage lived up to the series' high standards. That kind of pressure, especially when mixed with physical fatigue, left its mark. Yet Wade rarely talked about any of this while the cameras were rolling. He kept the focus on the fish, the people, and the myths. He didn't want to shift the attention to himself. That humility was part of what made River Monsters so powerful. But after the show ended, Wade slowly began to open up. In interviews and appearances, he described how difficult those years had been, how the constant travel, exposure, and lack of rest took a toll on his health. For viewers, it was the first glimpse into just how much he had quietly endured for nearly a decade. In hindsight, it's clear that River Monsters was more than just a TV show for Wade. It was a full-contact, years-long commitment that tested every limit he had. The adventure looked thrilling from the outside, and it was. But behind every epic catch was a man who had just survived another week in an unpredictable, often dangerous world. Still, even that wasn't what ultimately brought River Monsters to a close. Wade was worn down but not broken. He still had the will to keep going. But what he realized next would change everything, and it had nothing to do with survival, ratings, or the grind of production. It had everything to do with one quiet, unavoidable truth. But even danger wasn't the real reason the show ended. The next revelation was even more surprising. The monster list was real and complete. From the outside, River Monsters looked like it could go on forever. With millions of rivers, thousands of fish species, and endless local legends, why would the stories ever run out? But the truth, according to Jeremy Wade himself, is that the show was never meant to be infinite. It had a mission, a very specific one, and that mission had a finish line. Long before the first episode aired, Wade had created a list in his mind, a mental catalog of the most mysterious, terrifying, and legendary freshwater creatures around the world. These were not just rare species, but fish wrapped in folklore, often misunderstood or feared by local communities. Some had been blamed for deaths, others had eluded science. They weren't just catches, they were stories. And to make an episode of River Monsters, the story had to be more than just a fish in the water. It had to be part mystery, part myth, and part survival. That list was the foundation of the show. And over the course of 9 seasons, Wade pursued and eventually found every single creature on it. From the Amazon's Arapaima to the Congo's Goliath tigerfish. From catfish the size of grown men to snakehead fish that terrified entire villages, each season brought viewers one step closer to completing the journey. And eventually, it was done. Quietly, fully, and with nothing left hanging. Jeremy Wade didn't want to drag things out. He knew what happens when shows overstay their welcome. Audiences lose interest, the storytelling suffers, and in the case of River Monsters, the mystery, the very heart of the show, would fade. He was clear. If the creature didn't come with genuine fear or compelling lore, it wasn't worthy of an episode. He refused to force new seasons filled with filler content or rehashed fish just to keep the cameras rolling. Instead, he made a decision that very few people in television ever make. He chose to stop while the show was still beloved. He insisted on ending it with integrity. Rather than diluting the brand, Wade and the Animal Planet team made the final season a celebration of everything they had accomplished. They didn't just wrap up loose ends, they went out with some of their biggest stories yet. The final season of River Monsters was more than just another batch of episodes. It was a curated send-off. Wade revisited some of the most unforgettable locations from earlier seasons, adding context and closure. He also chased down long-rumored aquatic threats, including a mysterious sea monster in uncharted waters and a series of coral reef creatures allegedly responsible for deadly attacks in Indonesia. These weren't recycled ideas, they were the last remaining pieces of the puzzle. But even as the final fish were pulled from the depths, Wade's goodbye wasn't really about the animals anymore. It was about something deeper, something almost sacred. The truth is, River Monsters had become more than just a show. It was a symbol, a rare blend of adventure, education, and raw awe. And Wade knew that if it continued without the original mission, that symbol would fade. He protected it by letting it end. The integrity of River Monsters mattered more to Wade than airtime. And that decision, one based on completion, not collapse, is part of what turned the show into a modern legend. The monsters were caught, the myths were examined, and the mystery, instead of being drained dry, was honored by being allowed to rest. Still, that wasn't the final twist, because when the cameras stopped and the show faded out, Jeremy Wade did something few expected. He didn't pitch a reboot. He didn't hand off the reins. In fact, when offers came in, he did the opposite. But Wade's final goodbye wasn't just about fish. It was about protecting something even more sacred. Why Wade refused a reboot or spin-off. In today's entertainment world, few things are allowed to end gracefully. When a successful show wraps up, the industry scrambles to revive it. Spin-offs, sequels, reboots, and reimaginings flood the market. And with River Monsters, the temptation was no different. After all, the show was one of Animal Planet's most successful series ever. It had a global fan base, a recognizable host, and a format that could easily be replicated, or so they thought. But Jeremy Wade wasn't interested in stretching a finished story. When the offers came, he said no. Yes, there were discussions. Behind the scenes, network executives understood that River Monsters still had market value. They floated ideas, maybe a new version with different hosts, perhaps a spin-off focused on ocean predators, or a legacy-style series where Wade trains someone to take his place. But none of it felt right to him. He listened, but he declined. For Wade, River Monsters was never just a show about catching big fish. It was about mystery, tension, and truth. And trying to reboot that magic just to keep it going would have meant betraying its core. Wade's refusal wasn't about ego, it was about principle. He feared what he called selling out the concept. Throughout the original series, he had fought to keep the tone serious, the science accurate, and the message clear. River Monsters was built on a blend of conservation, education, and genuine adventure. Every story was rooted in local myth, real danger, and respect for the environment. To him, turning that into a flashy reality TV template, complete with dramatized conflicts or exaggerated stunts, would cheapen everything they'd built. There's a particular strength in knowing when to stop, and Wade exercised that strength with full awareness. Instead of chasing bigger deals or clinging to fame, he stepped back and let River Monsters speak for itself. He wanted the final season to be just that, the final season. No cliffhangers, no handoff, just closure. It's a move that calls back to another famous television goodbye. When Michael Landon ended Little House on the Prairie, he blew up the entire town of Walnut Grove in a final act that made it clear, this story is done. Jeremy Wade didn't need explosives, but his decision to walk away held the same kind of boldness. He didn't want someone else to take over River Monsters and reshape it into something unrecognizable. The show had been deeply personal. Every episode reflected his voice, his values, and his vision. Letting it continue without him felt like allowing a stranger to rewrite his life's work. And while some fans were disappointed that River Monsters wouldn't live on in a new form, many respected Wade for it. In an era when most media properties are recycled endlessly, his decision stood out. It was a quiet refusal to compromise, a way to preserve the integrity of a show that had always been about going deeper, not going longer. Wade didn't just protect a television series, he protected a legacy, one built on curiosity, discipline, and courage. And that legacy wasn't something he was willing to trade for more airtime or another paycheck. He had spent nearly a decade telling stories that no one else could tell, bringing to light creatures most people had never heard of, and doing it with a sense of awe that was completely genuine. So when it ended, he didn't look back. But just as fans began to understand and accept his decision, Wade shared something else, a side of the story that hadn't been part of the show. He had remained mostly quiet about the experience for years, but now, for the first time, he began to speak freely. And what he said next surprised even his most devoted followers. And that wasn't the last time Jeremy Wade shocked fans with his honesty. Jeremy Wade finally broke his silence. For years, fans speculated about the real reason River Monsters ended. Was it exhaustion, ratings, network politics? Jeremy Wade had kept mostly quiet. He didn't launch a farewell tour or issue dramatic press releases. The show ended, and he simply disappeared from view. But as time passed, Wade began to open up, and what he shared added an entirely new layer to the story. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't scandalous, it was honest, and in its own way, it was even more powerful than any theory fans had come up with. In a series of quiet, thoughtful interviews, Wade began to reflect on River Monsters with a kind of calm finality. He explained that he had, quite literally, done everything he had set out to do. The premise of the show was built on tracking mysterious creatures, freshwater legends that had terrified locals, sparked rumors, and eluded scientific understanding. But by the 9th season, those mysteries were gone. Some shows can run forever, Wade said. Ours couldn't. He wasn't saying it out of disappointment. He wasn't bitter or frustrated. In fact, he seemed proud. Wade believed in the original mission of the show, to search, to reveal, to demystify, and he felt it would be dishonest to keep going once that mission was complete. It would have been easy to stretch the format, fabricate new threats, or start chasing less compelling species just to keep the cameras rolling. But Wade didn't want to fake it. He respected the audience too much to give them anything less than the truth. That sense of responsibility to his viewers, to the animals, and to the idea of the show was what ultimately led him to walk away. Wade admitted that continuing would have felt like betraying what River Monsters stood for. The show was never about flashy entertainment or manufactured drama. It was about mystery and discovery. And once there was nothing left to discover within that specific world, the only right thing to do was to let it go. But Wade wasn't done exploring, not even close. What he realized after River Monsters was that his curiosity had only shifted, not disappeared. Instead of hunting specific fish, he began focusing on the broader health of the ecosystems that those fish depended on. That's how his next show, Mighty Rivers, was born. This time, Wade turned his attention to the world's greatest waterways, investigating what was slaying them, what could save them, and how human impact was altering some of the planet's most essential lifelines. Then arose Mysteries of the Deep, bigger into the unexplained underwater phenomenon. It opened Wade to an even wider range of stories, essays from cities drowned to the oddest creatures, all of which still carried his signature approach: cautious skepticism, deep research, and total devotion to the truth. He brought the same energy, the same storytelling, and the same scientific curiosity that made River Monsters a hit, but now with a new lens. These projects proved one critical thing: that Jeremy Wade was, after all, not a one-show wonder. He was a storyteller with a cause. He was not a man running after his own fame. He was a man running after answers. He could have turned River Monsters into an endless commercial, but he chose the path of integrity. Punctured several years later, it just affirmed precisely why the show hit so many audience chords. It was never grand melodrama, just as he didn't need razzmatazz exits to have the truth speak for itself. But that was just the beginning of fans' realizations as he moved into previously uncharted territory. Jeremy Wade might have retired River Monsters, but the spirit of this hardcore adventure, the search for the unknown, lives on in everything he touches. But if you thought Wade slowed down after River Monsters, think again. What Jeremy Wade did after the show. When River Monsters ended, some fans assumed Jeremy Wade would retreat from the spotlight. After nearly a decade of battling fierce predators and traveling to the ends of the earth, who could blame him for stepping back? But that's not what happened. Wade didn't slow down. He shifted gears. Almost immediately, he dove into new projects, taking his hard-earned experience and applying it to a broader mission. If River Monsters was about uncovering the truth behind myths, his new work would focus on exposing a far more urgent threat: the decline of the very environments those monsters called home. Wade's first post-River Monsters project, Mighty Rivers, flipped the script. This time, he wasn't searching for legendary beasts. He was investigating what was destroying the rivers themselves. Each episode focused on a major waterway, like the Amazon, the Mississippi, or the Danube, that had once teemed with life but now showed signs of alarming decline. Polluted, overfished, and changed by human hands, these mighty rivers were no longer what they once were. And Wade, drawing on years of first-hand observation, became both narrator and investigator. Mighty Rivers revealed a more reflective, more urgent side of Wade. It wasn't just about the thrill of the chase anymore. It was about understanding what happens after the chase ends. What happens when the creatures vanish, not because they've been caught, but because their habitats can no longer support them. For Wade, this wasn't an abstract question. He had seen the changes up close. Rivers that once teemed with life were now eerily empty. Places he'd visited during River Monsters had already shifted in disturbing ways. This wasn't just storytelling anymore. It was a call to attention. Then came Mysteries of the Deep, a series that widened his scope even further. In this project, Wade explored the unexplained: lost cities beneath the sea, sunken ships, unusual marine sightings. The format was looser, the canvas broader, but his approach remained the same: curiosity without sensationalism. He didn't exaggerate. He investigated. Wade's calm, grounded narration stood out in a genre often filled with hyperbole. His reputation as a straight shooter made even the wildest stories feel thoughtful, not gimmicky. Wade's passion for conservation became increasingly palpable beyond River Monsters, with views aired about the mighty rivers and mysteries of the deep. The increasing strength of Wade's conservation passion was directly correlated with his conscious decisions to use his public platform in efforts to promote endangered species, disappearing habitats, and the precarious balance that sustains freshwater ecosystems. The message was clear. These rivers are more than just filming locations or backdrops. They are lifelines for millions of people, animals, and cultures, and they face threats. Wade understood that for many viewers, he was their first introduction to these creatures and environments. That carried weight, so instead of fading away, he leaned into that responsibility. He started working more closely with environmental groups, speaking at educational events, and writing about the importance of freshwater conservation. He became more than a presenter. He became an advocate. And perhaps the most profound realization was this. Wade's post-River Monsters work wasn't a departure from the original show. It was the natural next chapter. Because at its core, River Monsters wasn't just about terrifying fish. It was about respect. Respect for nature, for mystery, and for the fragile line between human progress and environmental survival. That message, often hidden beneath the thrills, was always there. And it turns out, this deeper mission was always what River Monsters was truly about. The hidden purpose behind River Monsters. On the surface, River Monsters looked like a show about giant fish. It had all the ingredients of a television thrill ride: mystery, danger, suspense, and exotic locations. But those who watched closely began to notice something deeper. Beneath the pulse-pounding moments and eerie legends, there was a quiet, consistent message, one that grew louder as the seasons went on. Jeremy Wade wasn't just chasing monsters. He was dismantling fear. He was teaching. And most of all, he was inviting viewers to see the natural world, especially its most misunderstood creatures, in a new light. Wade has said in interviews that River Monsters was never just about the catch. Yes, reeling in a 200-pound catfish or a toothy tigerfish made for gripping television. But the real heart of each episode wasn't the final struggle with the rod and line. It was the journey to understand what people feared. From the beginning, Wade approached every legend with two questions. What is this creature? And why does it frighten people so much? Those questions turned the show into something more than a hunt. It became a kind of psychological expedition, one that peeled back layers of rumor, myth, and misunderstanding. Time and again, Wade discovered that the most feared animals were often the most unfairly blamed. A fish, thought to be a man-eater, turned out to be a scavenger. A rumored slayer species had been misidentified for decades, and with each revelation, something shifted in the audience. Fear gave way to fascination. Revulsion gave way to respect. Viewers began to see that these so-called monsters weren't villains, they were survivors, products of their environment, vital pieces of complex ecosystems. And that's where the second purpose of River Monsters quietly revealed itself. Every episode was, in its own way, a lesson in conservation. By focusing on individual species, Wade personalized the larger issue of environmental decline. He gave names, faces, and stories to creatures most people had never heard of, let alone cared about. Once viewers met these animals, saw their power, their beauty, and their vulnerability, it became harder to ignore the fact that many of them were disappearing, not because of nature, but because of human impact. Wade never preached. He didn't insert long speeches about pollution or overfishing. Instead, he told stories that made people care. And that, in the end, is what made him one of the most effective environmental voices on television without ever presenting himself as one. He became a quiet, environmental hero, someone who didn't hold rallies or run campaigns, but who used curiosity and empathy to shift public perception, one episode at a time. He turned fishing, an act often seen as purely recreational or competitive, into storytelling, and storytelling into a movement. Fans didn't just tune in for the next monster. They tuned in to learn something, to go somewhere unfamiliar, to understand something strange and wild. And that's no small feat in an era where distraction is constant and attention is fleeting. By the time River Monsters ended, it had achieved something few shows ever do. It didn't just entertain, it transformed how people thought about the world. It reminded them that beneath every myth lies a truth worth finding, and that some of the most important discoveries begin with fear. Wade took that fear, looked it in the eye, and taught millions to do the same. And the legacy of River Monsters? It was never just about catching fish. It was about illuminating the misunderstood, defending the fragile, and giving a voice to creatures that had none. That kind of impact doesn't need sequels. It doesn't need to come back, because it never really left. So, what do you think? Did Jeremy Wade end River Monsters at the perfect time? Or do you wish the adventure had gone on longer? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into the untold truth behind one of Animal Planet's most iconic shows, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the next video on your screen. We've got more shocking revelations from behind your favorite series, stars, and stories.